All right, hello everybody. We'll just give it a minute or two for people to jump on. Hello, Wayne. So, if I keep averting my eyes and my attention, it's because I've got several screens open at once. This is my first ever live stream to Facebook. So, I've got my Zoom screen open here, and I've got Facebook on open over here. Yeah, so if I keep looking away, it's because I'm looking up at your comments. I'll try to answer questions as we go along. Cool. Yeah, it's a very surreal moment for me. This is my very first live stream on Facebook, so hopefully everything will go well. If not, well, we tried. So yeah, I'll just give it another minute or two for people to jump on. Wayne says, going to be a great session. Looking forward to all three. Yeah, so in case you guys weren't aware, this is a 3-day event. So today we're talking about flexibility and stretching myths. Tomorrow we're talking about flexibility and strength. And on day 3 is just some basic coaching principles. All right. Hello, everybody who's saying hello. So I'll just set up my... bear with me a second. Share screen. Haha, Dan, I feel like I'm one of those support calls again. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you, Tanya. It's good to see you, by the way. Tessa says, so cool. Congrats, Dan. Yeah, thank you. Wayne says, yes, Tanya, imagine if support calls were this large. Yeah. Yeah, it's been a pretty impressive turnout, and I'm very grateful to everyone who's come to this. Again, if you're just tuning in, if you see my head diverting left and right, it's because I have Facebook on over here and I'm reading your comments in real time. But there's a lag between what I say and how it appears on Facebook. So it may take about 20, 30 seconds for me to answer your comments. The way that this is going to go is I'm going to go through each myth and talk about some of the science behind why these claims that people put out on the internet and social media are myths, and then I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to post comments, got questions in the comments, and I'll go through them. This will take about 40 to 45 minutes. That's how I've timed it. Hello from Montreal. Yeah, good to see you, Alina. Hey, Jane. Jane is a newly minted master flexibility trainer, passed the course with flying colours, and is going to be an outstanding coach. So well done to Jane. So this will take about 45 minutes. I have slides to show you guys as well. There are some scientific references that I use from the literature. If there's anything I say throughout this presentation or tomorrow or Wednesday, and you want citations or references for, let me know in the comments when I post this recording to the Facebook group, and I'll happily provide you guys with references and papers. Wayne says, woohoo, Jane. Yes, yeah, so there's a few master flexibility trainers and trainees on this as well, which is great. So I guess I should give everyone a warm welcome. This is day 1, the first day of the 3-day flexibility event that I'm hosting this week. From reading all of the comments and messages, I can tell that many of you are excited for this. And if anything, your enthusiasm tells me about the kind of situation that the health and fitness industry is in, especially when it comes to flexibility and stretching. If you have even just a passing interest in flexibility training, then you will no doubt be familiar with all of the mixed messages that get put out there regarding flexibility and stretching. And it can be very hard to know what to believe and who to trust, because unfortunately, the state of the industry at the minute is such that many of the myths that get put out there on social media, on blogs, podcasts, YouTube channels, etc., are perpetuated by people who, on the surface, are very intelligent and very well educated individuals, and many of them have doctorate level qualifications, a PhD or a doctor of whatever. And they often have years of experience in the health and fitness industry as well. But when you look at the stuff they're saying and you compare it to what the actual science says, you know, what the researchers are doing in the trenches and what they've been doing for over 100 years now, you see that a lot of what these so-called experts say is actually nonsense. And so today's webinar is, as you can see, is called Busting Flexibility Myths. And just like the name suggests, we're going to look at some of the most common claims that that people put out. Cool. Yeah, so if you just tune, there's a few people tuning in now. If you see my head diverting, it's because I've got Facebook open over here and Zoom is open over here. So I'm going to be looking backwards and forwards, but I'll be speaking in this direction. So if you ever see on social media, you know, a so-called expert saying something and you accept it at face value as being true without first looking at the evidence being presented, then you are falling for something which is called an appeal to authority. And it's a trick the mind plays to filter information which appeals to our biases, the things that we hold to be true. And so it's very easy. And if you've done that, I'm not, it's not a bad thing. We all do it. But it's very easy to do, especially on social media, because social media is so prevalent. And we'll see people with so many letters after their name. They may have a blue tick, or they may have, lots of followers. But that makes it very easy for people to leverage that perceived authority to support things that they're saying, which, like I said, you look at the science and it's just not true. So, by the way, if you hear a squeaking, it's my chair. Okay, I have a very, very squeaky chair, which if you've been on the group support calls for the Master Flexibility Trainer course, you'll be very familiar with. So, the thing to understand when you see stuff on the internet, and even when it's even when I give you information from the literature, from the scientific literature, you have to understand that this is second, third, and sometimes even fourth-hand information. And even when I give you information, it's passed through my brain and the filters in my brain, and I'm giving you my interpretation of the information. And so, by all means, follow who you want to follow, listen to whomever you want to listen to, but always do so with an open mind, and always have a critical eye to what's being said to you. And doing that will just make you better prepared for identifying myths and misunderstandings when they crop up. And don't be afraid to challenge people, including me. Anything I say on this webinar tomorrow, Wednesday, or anything I put out on Instagram is evidence-based. And so if you want me to provide evidence, I will do. Okay. And you shouldn't be afraid of asking anybody for evidence, no matter how many followers they've got, no matter if they have a blue tick, 10 PhDs, it doesn't matter. The true experts will give you the information you seek, and they won't try to hide it or cover it up. Okay. So before we move on to look at the first myth, something I want to do is just frame the perspective of this webinar. And, this webinar and really anything I share with you on social media is it's from the perspective of the scientific and academic literature. So everything that we're going to be discussing today is looked at through the lens of science. Okay. So what that means is there might be terms and words that are used in science that perhaps you don't use, or you might use them to mean something else. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm telling you to stop using those words or the terminology or the definitions that you prefer. All I'm telling you here is what the science says, and it's up to you to choose to use the scientific language or something else. Okay, so with that, we shall begin. Okay. I was going to take a drink of water. Alrighty. So the first myth is the claim that flexibility is only passive. And generally, when people say this, they usually mean one of two things. They usually mean, number one, flexibility is passive range of motion. And number two, flexibility is the ability of tissues, your muscle fibers, connective tissue, skin, so forth, to lengthen or be stretched under passive conditions. But those definitions are not accurate for a number of reasons. Flexibility is not at all defined in that way in the scientific literature. If flexibility was just passive, i.e., it occurs in the absence of any voluntary muscular activation, then what are we supposed to do with the nearly century of research looking at dynamic stretching and dynamic flexibility? In 1941, and I did a post about this the other day, there's a guy called Thomas Cureton who published an article it was titled Flexibility as an Aspect of Physical Fitness. And it was in the journal called Research Quarterly for the American Association for Health, Physical Education and Recreation. And in that article, he said that flexibility exercises are not passive movements in the true sense of the word, because there's always some level of tension present. And he said that the dynamic contraction of the active muscles is involved. And there's this quote I want to share with you from that paper. So he said that flexibility exercises may be given for conditioning in the sense that the full range contraction and extension of the muscles is excellent massage and exercise for the muscles, producing both a physical elongation and a strengthening of the musculature. Such exercises, if built up to sufficient dosage, may condition muscles, tendons, ligaments, and bones to greater tensile strength and elasticity, a factor which is basic to preventing injuries in many sports. And like I said, that was in 1941. So even in the early 1940s, which is 80 years ago, there was this general sense that flexibility meant range of motion, and it could incorporate all types of exercises, not only traditional static passive stretches, but also exercises which develop strength as the muscle is elongated. And this will tie in nicely with tomorrow's webinar, when we'll be looking at the relationship between flexibility and strength, which, contrary to many popular opinions at the moment, is not a new discovery. Okay, we've actually known about the intimate relationship between flexibility and strength for many, many years. And it was around this point from the 1940s onwards that researchers really started to look into dynamic flexibility and dynamic stretching. So we had some research pre-1940s, but from the 1940s onwards, the slope goes upwards for the amount of research that's available. Another example would be a famous pair of researchers called Weber and Krauss in 1949 in a journal called Physical Therapy. And they described hamstring stretches in which the test subjects moved under their own voluntary power, i.e. they were doing dynamic active stretches, okay? And as time has gone on, the number of studies into investigating dynamic stretching and dynamic flexibility has grown exponentially. So welcome to everyone else who's joining. So if you go to PubMed, which is just one search engine, and you do a search for dynamic stretching, you will get literally thousands of research papers on the subject. And when you do a search for dynamic flexibility, which in nearly 99% of the time is referring to dynamic active flexibility, you get even more results. And that's just one search engine. There are others which have access to more extensive libraries and therefore even more research papers. But, you know, when people say flexibility is just passive range of motion, they're ignoring decades and decades and decades of research into dynamic flexibility, right? Because if you say flexibility is only passive, you're ignoring the active types of flexibility, which have been studied immensely, for decades and decades. Now, often when people are describing flexibility like this, they say flexibility is passive. They will tend to say mobility is active range of motion. But that isn't what the word mobility means from a scientific literature perspective. The word mobility, or the most common usage of the word mobility in the scientific literature, means to maintain a mobile base of support, i.e. Walking, climbing stairs, etc. The next common definition of the word mobility is in reference to the internal motions of the joints, something called arthrokinematics. And that's basically how the bony surfaces within the joint move relative to one another. But again, that is not measured by range of motion. It's measured by something called joint play testing. Now, there are a few studies which use mobility in reference to range of motion, but they typically describe both active and passive mobility. So they've literally traded the word flexibility out for mobility, but that's based on a misinterpretation of a biomechanical principle related to degrees of freedom, which we won't go into now, but again, nothing to do with range of motion, okay? And those studies that do use the term mobility in reference to range of motion are so few that it isn't reasonable to say that that is a term that's used with any common usage throughout the scientific literature. So mobility is pretty much a word that people have come up with in the health and fitness industry to describe dynamic active range of motion. Maybe for the simple reason that it rhymes with stability. I don't know, but it became popular because the public at the time latched on to the cult of personality because somebody was selling a book or a training course at the time, and they were using this term mobility often to describe many different things. And so the term mobility has since spread almost like a cancer throughout the health and fitness industry that just causes confusion and frustration everywhere that you go. And the word flexibility came to be defined by these people as passive range of motion, or the passive lengthening of tissues, because they had the word mobility to describe active range of motion. So when people asked them, well, what about flexibility? What does that mean? They figured, well, since we call active range of motion mobility, we'll call passive range of motion flexibility. But again, this is flawed reasoning, because active range of motion and passive range of motion aren't actually a thing. There's no such thing as just active range of motion or just passive range of motion. When you say active and passive range of motion, you are not fully describing range of motion. It's not just active and passive. The word active means the presence of a voluntary muscular contraction, and the word passive means the absence of a voluntary muscular contraction. But those two words don't tell us if the joint is moving or not moving, i.e. dynamic or static, right? So we get dynamic and static range of motion, dynamic and static flexibility. And we need to know if the joints are moving or stationary, because the way the body responds to movement is very specific to the speed of motion, okay? And if we don't account for the speed of motion, or even the state of motion at all, we can't really account for these physiological responses that occur in the body. But there are 4 types of range of motion, and all 4 of them represent a specific type of flexibility, because again, throughout most of the scientific literature, flexibility is defined as the range of motion available at a joint or a group of joints. A few years ago, I did a literature review with a colleague of mine, and we examined more than 17,000 studies and found that in 95% of cases, this is how flexibility is defined: range of motion, period. And you can do your own literature review if you want to, and I guarantee that you will get the same or similar results. But flexibility is defined in this way for good reason. If you look in the English language dictionary, you will see that flexibility tends to have two parts to its definition. The first is the ability to bend without breaking, which makes sense because you have to bend joints when you move. The second part, though, is more applicable to range of motion. The second part means the ability to change or adapt. Okay, it's sometimes worded slightly differently, but that part is always there, the ability to change, right? When we think about what range of motion means, the word motion is actually a word that comes from the oldest branch of physics called classical mechanics, and it's where we get biomechanics from. And the word motion means to change position. The word range just means an amount or the difference between one value and another. So range of motion means the amount that something changed position, right? And when we're talking in the context of joint flexibility, it's the amount that joints can change position. Flexibility is the ability to change. In the context of human joints, it's how much your joints can change position. So therefore, flexibility is actually your ability to change the position of your joints. That is the actual definition of flexibility. That's what it means when it's tied up with range of motion. So the claim that flexibility is only passive is a myth for three main reasons. Number one, that's not how flexibility is defined at all in the scientific literature. Number two, mobility is not active range of motion or range of motion at all, because that is not how mobility is defined in most of the scientific literature. Number three, there's no such thing as just passive range of motion, okay? Passive is one half of two different types of range of motion. Now, again, I understand that some of you, or even many of you, will use the word mobility as part of your everyday training vocabulary, or maybe it's even part of your brand identity or business name. And if you want to keep using that word to describe the voluntary motions of the body, that's fine. But just keep in mind that in that context, it's not different from dynamic active flexibility. It's just a substitute word used to describe dynamic active flexibility. Okay, so I'll give you guys a minute or so to post any questions regarding this slide in the comments. As long as there's not too many, I'll answer some, but then we'll quickly move on. Kevin STR says marketing like foam rolling. Yeah, foam rolling is actually a technical term in the scientific literature. It's referred to as foam rolling, right? The marketing term would be myofascial release or self-myofascial release, because you're not releasing anything. All you're doing is stimulating the nervous system in a particular way that causes the nervous system to reduce the amount of muscle tone in that particular region. Easiest way to think about it is the nervous system is releasing its grip on the muscles, so the muscles can extend a bit further. That's what that means. All right, so there's no questions there, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next myth that we're looking at is the claim that flexibility is useless. And this one usually rears its ugly head when people claim that flexibility is only passive, mobility is active, and therefore somehow mobility is superior to flexibility, and it's nonsense. And in my opinion, it's a rather dishonest marketing gimmick, okay, that people do to draw people in to sell their book or their training courses or whatever it is they're trying to sell. And I don't mind at all if people want to sell a book or a training course, but I don't agree with dishonest practices like this, you know, where people are warping very well established terminology to try and create this illusion of superiority. And, you know, I'm not going to name names. You guys know exactly who I'm talking about, okay? And I really wouldn't mind if, you know, people using different terminology, but it's when they claim to be science-based, okay? So they warp the scientific language and then they claim to be science-based. But you can't claim to be science-based if you're not following the conventions of the scientific literature. It just doesn't make sense. So let's examine this claim in a bit more detail, in which people say static passive flexibility is useless. And that tends to be what they mean. They mean static passive flexibility is useless, right? Static passive flexibility is also known in the health and fitness industry as passive flexibility or static flexibility. It's the range of motion you can display when your joints are not moving and the muscles are not contracting. So think about just sitting in a static stretch like the splits, okay? Contrary to what people, spreading this myth are saying, static passive flexibility is not only not useless, okay, we need to use it, it's also absolutely crucial and fundamental to your ability to move, and I'll explain why. Your ability to move is a display of your dynamic active flexibility. And dynamic active flexibility is limited by a number of restraints that your body possesses to make sure that you don't hurt yourself when you're moving. An example of such a restraint would be the stretch reflex in the nervous system, which is part of what contributes to that resistance that you feel when you try to, move a limb quickly, right? And the stretch reflex has two parts, one which detects moving stretches and one which detects static stretches. And you can probably guess what they're called, the dynamic stretch reflex and the static stretch reflex. I did a post on Instagram about this not so long ago. So when people use this model, active and passive range of motion, they can't account for this, for the stretch reflex because it's dynamic and active. It's got nothing to do with active and passive, right? If they are going to account for it, they have to admit that their model of range of motion is wrong, okay, which not many of people want to do. Now, so because dynamic active flexibility has more restraints acting against it, it will always be less than your static passive flexibility. And the closer your dynamic active flexibility gets to your static passive flexibility, the more these restraints act against you. So if you wanted to do, like in the picture, you wanted to be a kickboxer and you wanted to kick straight up in the air, you would never be able to do that without doing splits, or at least close to the splits, okay, at least for that kind of form. So in order to improve your dynamic active flexibility, you have to improve your static passive flexibility, okay? So improving static passive flexibility and doing static passive flexibility training or static passive stretching, most people just call it static stretching, is imperative to improving your ability to get into certain positions and to transition from one position to the next. Otherwise, you're just going to be fighting against your own body. I'll give you a functional example. And since my background is in martial arts, I'll give an example shown here that looked at a kickboxing and karate sport technique. So in 2020, phone's going off. So in 2020, there's a research team consisting of Holbling, Bakker and Dabnitsky, and I hope I've pronounced their names correctly. And this was published in the journal Sports Biomechanics. And they assessed the kicking technique of kickboxers, more like sport point fighting or sport karate, if you know martial arts well at all. And they examined the kicking ability of kickboxers using something called the double side kick. And to give you a boxing analogy, a double side kick is it's like a double jab, but with the side of the foot. And what they found was that athletes who had better static passive flexibility in the standing toe touch, which I think some people will call a pike stretch, and also in the seated side split, also called the straddle, not the pancake like I used to think it was called. The people who could get further in those stretches could display larger joint angles during the kicking technique. And they were able to display larger joint angles in the kicking technique, which is a dynamic technique, because their limit of static passive flexibility had been pushed closer to the anatomical limit of flexibility, thus permitting greater range of motion under dynamic conditions. So a simple way to think about this is that static passive flexibility is your movement potential. And by doing special exercises that develop dynamic flexibility, we can show more and more of that potential in movement. But if we don't have the required potential, if we don't have the required static passive flexibility, you won't develop that dynamic motion. And it's funny because in the martial arts, you can meet many people who can do the splits but can't do high kicks because they've got the static passive flexibility, but they didn't develop the dynamic flexibility. But you will never, ever meet someone who can kick like in that picture that's on screen, who cannot do the splits or close to it, okay? Because there are too many neurological and mechanical restraints acting against that movement if it's close to the limit of static passive flexibility. So this claim that flexibility is useless is a myth, because without static passive flexibility, you're going to be fighting against yourself when you try to move into those positions you want to display. So it's not only not useless, it's also necessary. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys, so many people have posted some questions. I'll just answer those. If you have any about this particular slide, post them in the comments and I'll answer them. So Hector says, yeah, thoughts on foam rolling, myofascial release, Theragun, etc. They're good for creating a temporary increase in range of motion, but apart from making you feel good, they really don't achieve much else. Joint flexibility versus mobility. Joint flexibility is range of motion at the joints. Mobility is nothing to do with range of motion. It's your ability to walk. That's basically what it means. And I'll be going through that a bit more tomorrow. But mobility means to maintain a mobile base of support, i.e. get up out of a chair, walk to another room, walk up and downstairs, etc. Okay, this is why, you know, wheelchairs, Zim frames, walking canes are called mobility aids. Okay. Sorry, can you resume what flexibility is for you? Flexibility is how far you can move your joints. That's literally what the term range of motion means. And flexibility and range of motion are interchangeable. So is dynamic active flexibility represented in the active range of motion then, instead of the word mobility? Yes. When people use the term mobility to mean how far you can move your joints, they are using it as a substitute for dynamic active flexibility. But there's no such thing as just active flexibility. Active is part of a type of flexibility. There are 4 types: dynamic active, dynamic passive, static active, and static passive. There's no such thing as just static or dynamic or active or passive. They all come together because your joints are either moving or not moving, and your muscles are either contracting or not contracting. Okay, so those 2 states occur at the same time. So you can't just have active flexibility. Active just means you're contracting your muscles. Joint distractions with bands, thoughts about them? Yes, so this is a really good point, because I said that the main usage of the word mobility in the scientific literature is being able to walk, basically. It is used as well in reference to the joints, but in reference to the internal motions of the joints, which has nothing to do with range of motion. Okay, they're called spins, rolls, and glides, and it's how one, say that's the head of the femur, the ball. This is the acetabulum, the socket. It's how you know the quality of these motions. And sometimes these motions can get a little bit funky. And so we have to apply force into the joint using either our hands, like a physical therapist would, or a band, as in a banded distraction. When you place the band around your leg or thigh, the theory is it's pulling the head of the femur into a more optimal position. That technique is called a mobilization with movement. The mobilization part refers to the force being directed into the joint to improve the joint's mobility. So the main usage of the term mobility from a scientific perspective is being able to walk. The second most common way is in reference to joint mobility is arthrokinematics, or those internal joint motions, which are completely passive. You can't feel them. You have no control over them. Okay. Yeah. So banded distractions can be useful. They can help get rid of pain. They're a tried and tested technique called mobilizations with movement. But the mobilization part means the force being directed into the joint. You know, you can't do a mobilization by moving. Okay. Something else has to apply the force to move the bony surfaces within the joint capsule. Okay. Christina says, I studied FRC. The system claims to be evidence-based and uses the term mobility, claiming flexibility is passive range of motion and mobility is active with control. That's absolute nonsense, okay? On the old FRC blog, they were using the term flexible strength before they picked up mobility in about 2012. It's absolute horseradish. It's nonsense, okay? And in my opinion, they have a lot to answer for the confusion, okay? Prior to them, it was Mobility WOD and CrossFit, which was spreading this mobility craze. They've jumped on that, and that is their interpretation of the terminology, but it's a sales gimmick, okay? You know, you could do your own literature. Don't take my word for it. Do your own literature review. You know, go into PubMed or Google Scholar, type in flexibility training, and it'll come up saying joint flexibility, muscle flex. It's all to do, and it will describe it as the range of motion at a joint or a group of joints. So yeah, it's absolute nonsense. It really is. So is dynamic active flexibility simply getting the muscle strong in static passive flexibility? No, it's dynamic active flexibility. Some strength is involved, but it's your ability to display part of that range of motion at speed. So if you wanted to do a high kick, you'd first develop the ability to do the splits to give you the movement potential. You would then do leg raises to the side and to the front with increasing speed and range of motion to improve your ability to display some of that flexibility at speed. Okay. Is there a better order to train the different types of flexibility? I mean, both in long-term periodization and in single training. Yeah, so I'll just talk about single workout now because I need to move on. Generally speaking, when you have a workout, dynamic stretching goes at the beginning because it prepares you for the main part of the workout. You do the main part of the workout. If you've got strength exercises, do them. At the end of the workout, you do isometric stretching, which is also known as static active stretching. It's just stretching involving isometrics. The FRC guys call this pails and rails, which is a completely pointless and unnecessary acronym. Okay, so you stretch using isometrics, and then you do your relaxed or static passive stretches at the end. You can't go wrong with that sequence. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So we've done this one, haven't we? I'll answer more of the comments in a little bit. Here we go. So next we come to the myth that stretching doesn't work. And whenever you see this myth being thrown around, you have to clarify two things. First, you need to check what type of stretching the other person is talking about. And second, you have to check what they mean by doesn't work, okay? If they're talking about regular static passive stretching doesn't improve dynamic active flexibility, they would be correct. But in most cases, or most of the times that I see this claim being made, the person's referring to static passive stretching, and they're claiming that it doesn't work to improve range of motion. But this is a myth because most of the research on stretching will show that all types of stretching will improve range of motion to some degree. So they all work to some extent. Whether or how well a particular stretching method works depends on something called the dose-response relationship, which is unique to each person. So you will respond to a way of stretching differently than I will, okay? We tend to see males respond better to isometric stretching, which is sometimes called PNF stretching as well. And females tend to respond better to static passive stretching. And that's probably down to differences in muscle thickness and connective tissue quality. Sometimes there can be no difference between them. I know that PNF/isometric stretching, it's a more formal term, is static active stretching because you're stationary and you're contracting the muscles, is often touted as being the most effective method. But sometimes research shows there's no difference. For example, the study I've cited here by Worrell and colleagues in 1994 showed there was no difference between PNF/isometric stretching and good old-fashioned static passive stretching. I know that the 2021 review by Afonso and colleagues, and I've cited it there on the screen, has become very popular recently. Especially with people who prefer strength training to stretching. And I've seen a lot of people claiming that this review, called Strength Training versus Stretching for Improving Range of Motion, they claim that it's superior to stretching. They claim that this systematic review showed that strength training improves range of motion better and faster than good old-fashioned static passive stretching. It didn't. It did not say that. All it said was strength training can be as effective as static passive stretching. And what that means is some people will progress fastest with strength training, some people will progress fastest with static passive stretching. And they actually said in that review, and this makes me wonder if people actually read the stuff that they're citing and referencing. They said that there's people who won't respond well to strength training for improving range of motion. You know, it's just the way it is. Just like there will be people who don't respond well to static passive stretching for improving range of motion. So each remains a viable alternative for people who don't respond well to strength training. Static passive stretching is an option, and vice versa. If static passive stretching doesn't work for you, try strength training. And you know, static passive stretching also confers other benefits that active types of stretching don't. So things like isometrics and strength training. One of those is reducing muscle stiffness. So muscle stiffness is the intrinsic resistance to stretch which your tissues have. Okay. And as we age, and the guys from the Master Flexibility Trainer course, you know, we cover this subject in depth on in the module on flexibility and aging. But as we get older, stiffness will naturally increase because we tend to get a greater deposition of connective tissue and collagen fibers. And collagen is very tough, very strong, very stiff, doesn't like to be stretched. Okay, that's why tendons are made out of the stuff. And active type stretches like isometrics or PNF and even weightlifting don't really decrease stiffness, and if anything, they actually increase stiffness. Okay, but there's a study published just this year by Nakamura and colleagues, which showed that static passive stretching and hold relaxed stretching, which is a type of isometric or PNF stretching, were both very good at increasing range of motion, but only static passive stretching reduced tissue stiffness. Quite a few comments there, so I'll answer those in a minute. Okay, so you know, the main reason why static passive stretching may reduce tissue stiffness is probably to do with some change in the length of the tissues, but we don't know. The research on that still isn't fantastic. Now, the thing about stiffness is when a tissue or a muscle is stiffer, it needs more force to be stretched. So as we age and tissue stiffness increases, we need progressively more force to stretch those tissues, which means potentially stretching can become more uncomfortable because more force is being used to stretch the tissues. Therefore, there's greater pressure on the nerve endings responsible for detecting pain and pressure. And so if we can somehow reduce stiffness as we age, as we can do with static passive stretching, potentially we're making stretches more comfortable, and therefore we're more likely to engage in flexibility training and remain flexible throughout our entire lifespan. So when people say that stretching doesn't work, what they actually mean is the stretching methods I tried didn't work for me. Okay, and the main reasons why stretching may not work for someone are, number one, doing the wrong exercises. Okay, so you have to find which exercises your body best responds to. Number two, using the wrong training loads. And number three, doing the exercises in the wrong order. Those tend to be the main reasons why stretching doesn't work. So it's not that stretching doesn't work, it's that people couldn't make stretching work for them, okay? But all types of stretching will show some increase in range of motion. And what we really mean here is how effective and efficient is it, right? Because some people who don't respond well to static passive stretching could take 12 months to reach their flexibility goal, whereas if they switch to strength-based training, they could reach it in 3 to 6 months, and vice versa. People could be trying to lengthen their muscles with strength training when really it's going to be more effective with static passive stretching. So I will give you guys a few minutes to write some comments while I answer these. So Matteo says, is there a better order to train the different types? Oh no, I've already answered that one. So Stephanie says, so you have to get strength to go at the maximum of your flexibility during dynamic movement. Yeah, so your ability to move depends primarily on two things. Number one, the ability of the muscles being stretched to relax, and number two, the ability of the muscles contracting or shortening to actually have the strength to move the joint into position. Okay, so if you're thinking about the leg raise to the front, you have to have strength in the hip flexors to do that, right? You could do all the hamstring stretches in the world and be super, super flexible, but if you don't work on hip flexor strength or agonist strength, because they're the agonists, they pull the joint into position, it's not going to work. Okay, so there's this, you know, kind of, we have to work both sides of a joint essentially. We have to increase the extensibility of the tissues which are being stretched and reduce their resistance to stretch, while also increasing the strength of the muscles which contract. Okay. So Tara says, so can you build great static flexibility without doing actual static passive stretches, like doing only strength training while pushing a range of motion more and more, for example, with Jefferson curls, Romanian deadlift, etc., enough for your back and hamstrings? So the best way to improve or to get the most static passive flexibility is always going to be static passive stretching, because with static passive stretching, you can stretch the muscles beyond the end of the active force length curve, which is basically the point at which you can no longer perform a muscular contraction. And so you can always push static passive flexibility beyond that. Static active and loaded dynamic active stretching will help you get very, very close, but static passive stretching will always allow you to get further and further in your stretch. Okay, but the further you can get in your stretch, the further you can move those loaded stretches as well. So is PNF just static active flexibility? Yeah, well, PNF is static active stretching. So flexibility is the range of motion. Stretching is the method we use to get the range of motion. So yeah, PNF, isometrics, PAILs, rails, all those names, static active stretching, because you're holding the position for more than a second and you're contracting the muscles. Okay. Can you give one example of a stretch done in each kind of range of motion? Yeah, so a dynamic active stretch would be a squat, okay? Trying to improve your squat depth while you're moving. You're moving, it's dynamic, you're contracting the muscles under your own power, it's active. So it's dynamic active. Dynamic passive, we don't really tend to do in practical terms. It's more used with therapists when they're moving a joint around. Say someone's got frozen shoulder, the physical therapist is moving the joint with their hands. It's dynamic, but the person on the massage couch or the therapist table is completely relaxed, and the force being provided to move that joint is provided by another person. So with the muscles in the joint, it's dynamic, it's moving, but it's passive because the muscles aren't contracting. Okay. Static active would be if you were a martial artist, sticking your leg up to the side in the air, or doing a split between two chairs, because you are holding yourself up using the strength of your inner thighs. So you're static, or you're stationary, so you're static, and the inner thigh muscles are contracting, so it's active, static active. And static passive is just any kind of relaxed stretching. So lying on your back and pulling your foot towards your head and just holding it in position without contracting any muscles in the leg is static passive stretching. Is there any good scientific data about breathing and stretching? What is good? What is bad? To summarize the data on breathing and stretching, exhale as you increase the stretch, and you'll get a much better result than if you inhale when you increase the stretch. That pretty much sums up most of the research available on breathing and flexibility. There's more to it than that. I'm being a bit sarcastic there, but if you're doing static passive stretching, where you're trying to relax into the position, deep nasal breathing is very effective, because it puts you into a parasympathetic state, which reduces muscle tone, and that allows you to stretch a bit further. Hector says, have proficiency in which type of flexibility is best for injury prevention, or to rephrase, what even is the role of fascicle length and injury prevention? So that's a very complex subject, which I don't have time to go into now, but a lot of the questions around flexibility and stretching and injury, there's not a great deal of protective benefit conferred by immediate stretching prior to an activity. Okay, the best that stretching can do immediately prior to an activity like a race or a workout is just prepare you for that activity. Now, if you have very restricted range of motion, then it can actually be beneficial. And I think I actually talk about one of the papers a little bit later on in this presentation. So if you lack the ability to get into a certain position, so you lack the flexibility to get into that position, you can't exert force in that position. And the ability to exert force in a position, i.e. strength, is crucial to injury prevention because it stops external forces from deforming the tissues to the point of breaking. Okay, so you need to have volitional strength, or your ability to produce voluntary force, and also tissue strength, which is the structural integrity of the tissues. Okay, but we don't have time to go into that now. Let's just move on. So the next myth we're going to look at is stretching is slow, or when people say this, they mean it's really, really, really slow. And again, this mostly comes down to the methods that people are using, which are not optimal for their individual physiology. And they haven't hit the ideal dose-response relationship for their body. And when they combine, doing the wrong things with doing them in the wrong order and using too little or too much training load, then of course their progress is going to stagnate. But rather than say, it's my choice of exercises and my programming which is making my progress slow, they prefer to blame it on the method, which they probably don't know how to use effectively. Most of us will look at the word slow and will think that it means takes a long time. But some people will look at that and think it means I have to sit in a stretch for a long time to see some type of progress. So slow doesn't necessarily mean, when people use this, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to take you a long time to reach your goals. It can also mean that, you have to spend time in a particular stretch. And for some people, that's true. Sometimes your best response from stretching will come from spending several minutes in that stretch, and that's just your physiology. Okay. In 1971, famous researcher called Nikolai Azolin, I think he was a famous pole vaulter, he reported that with rational training, flexibility increases from day to day. That means that amongst the different motor abilities, strength, endurance, and so forth, it increases probably the fastest of all of them. Now, traditionally, static active stretching, i.e. isometric / PNF, is often described as the fastest and most efficient method of stretching. And that is true to an extent. However, we have to understand that many of the studies supporting its efficiency were based on using male test subjects. And males tend to respond more favorably to static active stretching than to static passive stretching. And many of the studies which demonstrated that static passive stretching doesn't produce as much range of motion over a period of time compared to those methods also use males, and males tend to respond less favorably to static passive stretching. So you just have to bear that in mind. One of the reasons why static active stretching is probably more effective for males is because they can produce more voluntary force in an isometric contraction. When you can produce more force, the depression in stretch sensitivity that follows an isometric contraction is greater, so you can stretch further. And there's lots of narratives around what happens after we do an isometric contraction. It's got different names: autogenic inhibition, the stretch tolerance involved as well, but it's still something we're not sure why it happens. Okay, but even static passive stretching doesn't need to take ages to see improvements. In their book, Explosive Power and Jumping Ability for All Sports, Tadeusz Stajiński and Henryk Szasanski, hope I pronounce their names right, explained that to get the most range of motion that you can possibly get in your knees and ankles takes about a month. In the spine, it should take about 2 months. And in the hips, it's about 2 to 3 months. But bear in mind that this data is based upon people who were already in very good shape when they started stretching. And this means that your progress, especially in static passive stretching, is determined primarily by your starting levels of strength and flexibility. So for someone who is already very strong and has, regular training habits, they will probably, be able to reach a full split in as little as 3 to 6 months. Whereas somebody who hasn't done much training for a long time, hasn't stretched in years, would probably take 6 to 12 months. Okay, so progress is all relative. Okay, a lot of people cite the 2021 study by Afonso and colleagues that I talked about in the last slide, and again, they say strength training is more effective as stretching. And when it comes to rate of progress, that's simply not true. Strength training and stretching, static stretching, dynamic stretching, can produce pretty much the same effect as strength training, but it's so individually variable. The only way to know what is going to work best for you is through trial and error. The research gives us guidelines and general rules of flexibility training, but finding out the precise recipe that works best for you, you can only figure that out for yourself. If you're not sure how to do that for yourself, hire a coach. If you want to become a coach, the Master Flexibility Trainer course will show you how to do that, and the current intake, which starts on the 20th of June, is still open for registration. So how long it takes you to achieve your flexibility goals depends primarily on your training history, your lifestyle habits, and your consistency with training, as well as finding the right method that works best for you. And you can discover that stuff very, very quickly. You could work it all out in less than a week. Okay, so just something to bear in mind. So I'm just going to check the comments now. If you've got any more questions, throw them in and I'll answer them. So Stephanie says, is it true that if you're more than 45 seconds in a static passive position, you start to stretch the tendon instead of the muscle, knowing that tendon is the continuation of it, but that would damage articulation? No, I mean, anytime there's any kind of stretching motion, force is already being transmitted all the way along the connective tissue continuum, including to the tendon. So the idea that it takes 45 seconds to stretch the tendon, no, that's probably the result of some study which reported that, but no, physiologically and anatomically, we know that force is spread as soon as it starts to generate, and force starts to arise and be dissipated both longitudinally and radially, sideways or outwards, through the entire muscle tendon unit as soon as you kind of hit that point where you feel the sensation of resistance, because that's both active tension from the stretch reflex and passive tension from the muscles. So if it took 45 seconds for a movement to stretch the tendon, you'd probably rupture the muscle, because it would stretch while the tendon is there to anchor it to the bone and kind of help resist the stretching, basically. So you probably tear the muscle belly if that was true. Lindsay says, would a kick where the person is using momentum at the height of the kick be dynamic passive as we do in dance, or still dynamic active? Yeah, so it's still dynamic active because you're using the strength of the hip flexors to throw the leg up there. What you're doing is you're utilizing momentum, which is think of it like the power of a moving object, right? It's to do with the mass of your thigh, and that's helping accelerate your leg up there. So you're harnessing momentum, but the initial contraction was active, okay? And you're still contracting your leg to take it up there, okay? So, and there'll also be a braking mechanism or a braking kind of sensation occurring with the muscles being lengthened, because they'll be doing an eccentric or eccentric contraction to control the rate of ascent so that your leg doesn't come off and fly behind you. So it's dynamic active. Dynamic passive is when you are not controlling the movement, okay? Kamala says, how to manage recovery from stretching. Is pushing your max range all the time detrimental in the long run? This is specific to me because I developed some niggles while training for splits. Okay, so muscle soreness is a sign of muscle damage. And I'm going to talk about muscle damage in a short while. But if you're sore from stretching, don't push it as hard, okay? Because stretching is still a way of loading the tissues. It's a way of stressing the tissues mechanically. So if you're sore and you're continuing to stretch the muscles, you're just dumping more stress on them, okay? So if you're sore or it hurts when you push your thumb into the tissues, take the day off, okay? Your body will thank you for it, all right? Does ballistic stretching mean you are doing speedy dynamic stretching beyond your passive ROM? Is it even possible? Is it safe or useful? Yeah, so ballistic stretching is a controversial subject because some studies show that it's harmful, some studies show that it's not. The confusion comes because some researchers use the term ballistic stretching to describe just fast dynamic stretching. Ballistic stretching is a form of dynamic active stretching, but it tends to be done at a rate of greater than 120 beats per minute. Okay, so you're doing 2 stretches a second. You can't cover a large range of motion over that time, so you tend to do it towards the end of range. It's unlikely that you would be able to use it to hit your true static passive limit of flexibility. If you did, it's likely going to cause muscle damage, and this is one of the reasons why ballistic stretching typically reports very high levels of muscle soreness, okay? Ballistic stretching is not very effective for increasing range of motion. The best way to use ballistic stretching, because it's really a type of plyometric stretching, is to first have the range of motion and then do ballistic stretching within that range, because isometrics, eccentric stretching, and static passive stretching are not only more effective, they're also much safer as well. Ballistic stretching is a very inefficient and ineffective way of stretching. And typically people who advocate for it are already flexible themselves, okay? And so it's not great for beginners, basically. So make sure you have the range of motion first and then use ballistics. Just take a glass of water because I'm losing my voice. What do you think about stretching on a bouncing way? There's a myth it's bad. That's ballistic stretching. Literally just talked about that. Is there a maximum timing for static passive stretching? There is a minimum, which seems to be around 30 seconds. Maximum, I'd say after 5 minutes, you hit the point of diminishing returns. But I'm going to talk about that stuff in a minute. After static passive stretching for 1 to 2 minutes, people are advised to lay on the ground for a minute to act as a dead zone, claiming blood is entering muscle for this first time in a while. Is this true? No. Kevin says tendons are highly involved in landings to the point where they even lengthen further than the muscle fascicles, especially Achilles tendon. This tendon lengthening does happen very fast too. Yeah, that's true. Should we worry about overstretching the ligaments? My physio said static passive stretching is not ideal for healthy ligaments, but I keep hearing conflicting opinions. You shouldn't be stretching ligaments, period. They don't respond very well to stretching, okay? So if you're feeling the sensation of stretch in the joint rather than the belly of the muscle, you need to change your stretching position to place the leverage of the stretch on the belly of the muscle, because although we can elicit physical responses or physical changes in the architecture of tissue if certain conditions are met, we're primarily trying to work with the nervous system. And so ligaments are designed to be tight to hold the bones together. They generally don't get in the way of normal joint motion, so we should be targeting the belly of the muscle where most of the muscle spindles are, and that is how we can influence the sensitivity of the stretch reflex. Okay, moving on. We're almost there, I promise. So the next myth is that stretching makes you weak. Again, most of the time when people say this, they're talking about static passive stretching. And again, this is not so much a complete myth, but rather it needs clarification, because there are different types of stretching. And saying stretching makes you weak is ambiguous, right? It's not a complete myth, because static passive stretching does have a slight inhibitory effect, which can, kind of temporarily reduce force production or strength. But even then, the effect is not really that great. And for some people, it's a price worth paying in order to be able to get into a deeper range of motion. The idea that stretching makes you weak is primarily based upon studies which looked at doing static stretches in a warm-up. And the studies in the early to mid 2000s, which examined this, used long duration stretching, right? But there was really no distinction made about the difference between long and short duration. And now we tend to say long duration is greater than 60 seconds, short duration is less than 60 seconds, okay? And this is 60 seconds cumulative. So it could be 2 sets of 30 seconds, 4 sets of 15, 1 set of 60, etc. And there was a great study done in 2016 by David Bem and his colleagues. I have an interview with David Bem on my podcast if you're interested. What they found was that when you stretch for more than 60 seconds, there is a reduction in force output and therefore subsequent performance. But what they found is if you limit the stretches to less than 60 seconds, it doesn't, okay? Especially when you follow it up with dynamic stretching. So if you're doing a warm-up, I'll talk about this in a bit, do your static stretching, make sure it's less than 60 seconds per muscle group. Again, you can structure it how you want. It's a couple of sets of 30, 4 sets of 15, 6 sets of 10, 10 sets of 6, whatever you want, whatever takes your fancy, okay? But it's when you hold it for more than 60 seconds, we tend to see this increase in force reduction. A lot of people have cited a study from last year by Germana Barbosa and colleagues, and I've put the reference there. The title of that reference was Chronic Effects of Static and Dynamic Stretching on Hamstrings, Eccentric Strength and Functional Performance. Bit of a long-winded title. What they basically looked at was 3 groups of people: people who did nothing, so the control group, people who did dynamic stretching 3 times a week, and people who did static passive stretching 3 times a week. Again, the static passive stretches were held for a total of 90 seconds. And it's called chronic effects. Chronic just means anything longer than a day, right? But the study was a little over 3 weeks, okay? All 3 groups showed reductions in strength. The static passive stretching group showed slightly greater reductions in strength. I think it was about 8% more, which isn't a massive amount. But the problem with this study is people have used it to claim that just doing static passive stretching at all is going to reduce your strength gains or inhibit your strength gains. And that's just not true. The reason all 3 groups reduced strength is because they didn't do anything else. And after a certain length of time, a detraining effect starts to take hold and you will lose strength, okay? But when you look at the body of evidence and we see static stretching combined with strength training, it's not only, strength is not affected, it's actually quite beneficial. An example here by, and there's loads of these studies, if you want more, just let me know, But a study by Kokkonen and colleagues in 2010 showed that when you had beginners first learning to lift weights, those who combined it with static passive stretching made greater gains in strength compared to those who didn't include it. Okay, so the claim that stretching on your days off is going to make you weak is absolute garbage. Okay, and if you follow me on Instagram, you'll know there's been a bit of backwards and forwards about this. Yeah, cool. So the basic takeaway from this is, you know, a well-rounded training program is going to include both active and passive methods. Okay, we have to do the passive stuff to keep a, you know, to manage tissue stiffness, especially as we get older, and also to increase our static passive range. We have to do the active or strength-based stuff because we all need strength. It's something we can't get away from, and strength is one of the things that is going to safeguard you as you get older. You have to think long game when it comes to flexibility. Okay, not thinking, how flexible am I going to be a year from now? Think, how flexible am I going to be 40 or 50 years from now? Okay. And as long as you're training strength and flexibility at the same time, you have nothing to worry about. Okay. So stretching, if all you ever did was static passive stretching, it would make you weak because you're not training strength over time. But if you combine it with strength training, not only are you not going to be weak, but you may find that static stretching augments your strength gains. Okay. I'll give it a minute, let you guys ask some questions in the comments, and then we'll move on. If there are no comments, I shall progress. We've only got a couple of slides left. I promise we'll be quick. This is only meant to be 45 minutes, but we've dragged on a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So the next myth is that stretching hurts performance, and this follows on quite nicely from the last one, that claim that stretching makes you weak. And again, this myth is based upon findings of research studies that said doing static passive stretching in a warm-up is harmful to performance. But the review by David Bem and colleagues found that when you keep the sets to 60 seconds per muscle group and you follow it up with dynamic stretching, not only is the potential negative effect on athletic performance inconsequential or insignificant, it's actually recommended for reducing muscle injuries. Now, I'm not talking about tendon injuries here. I'm talking about muscle injuries, muscle strains. Okay, it's a very specific thing, because a lot of studies looking at stretching and the effects on injuries look at tendon injuries, okay, not muscle injuries. So that's a very important distinction to make. And this review is open access. You can find it and read it for free. But if you can't find it, I will post it in the group. Just let me know if you want to read it. So now, if you were to spend an hour doing static stretches for the muscles that you're going to be training, and then you worked out, your performance is going to be affected, especially if you're doing a max effort performance, right? So it's against this dose response relationship. Okay, how does your body respond to the dose of stretching? So the magic number is 60 seconds per muscle group, and follow it up with dynamic stretching. So to keep things very simple, a good arrangement for how you do things in a warm-up is as shown on screen. Do some joint rotations, and I know there's lots of claims made out there about how you should do joint rotations. None of it's very well supported with the literature. Just move your joints in a circle backwards and forwards 10 to 15 times in each direction. That will generally suffice as a nice localized warm-up for the joints. You know, the research from a branch of biological physics called biotribology, which is the study of synovial fluid and its influence in joints, shows that synovial fluid is as prepared as it can be after about 15 repetitions of just general movement. Okay, so it doesn't have to be slow and controlled. It doesn't have to be a specific angle. Just move your joints in circles. Okay, people take this stuff way too far. All right. Next, just do a general cardiovascular warm-up. It can be jogging, jumping rope, shadow, whatever you find fun. Okay, and that gets your heart rate up, causes a bit of a light sweat, and you notice a bit of a change in your breathing. That's generally enough. Next, if you need to do static passive stretches to get into a position, do them, okay? Then do dynamic stretches for the same muscle groups, ideally mimicking the same actions of the main part of the workout. Then do the main part of the workout. So if you were doing a squatting workout, say it was leg day, you do your joint rotations, treadmill, cross trainer, shadow boxing, jumping rope, whatever you want, 15 minutes. Then do hold the bottom position of the squat for 2 sets of 30 seconds. If you struggle to get into the bottom position of the squat, stretch the muscles which are tight first. Ankles are usually a prime culprit, hamstrings, adductors, and so forth. Then just do body weight squats or air squats. You could even do some with an empty bar. That would be your dynamic stretching warm-up. Then go on to your squats, okay? It doesn't have to get more complicated than that. Yeah, so post questions in the comments and I'll answer the ones that just come up. Okay. Does stretching the same muscles after working them out do more good than harm? Is it better to do right after strength training or maybe a few hours after, or leave stretching to the next day? So this depends on how intense your workout was. If you've just done very intense eccentric training for your hamstring, say you've done very heavy, high volume Romanian deadlifts or straight leg, stiff leg deadlifts, and your hamstrings are feeling fried, they're really taxed, leave the static passive stretching for later in the day. The thing about static stretching, you can do it any time of day. You don't need a warm-up to do it, and you can do it as many times as you want, okay? There is a point of diminishing returns where you're probably not going to get much more of a benefit, and more isn't always better, especially if you're stretching quite intensely. So you could leave it to later in the day, or you could just do very gentle stretching. But how intense your stretching is going to be will depend upon how intensely you work those muscles, okay? So if you've decided to leave it to the next day and you've got very intense delayed onset muscle soreness in the hamstrings, don't stretch them. Wait until the DOMS is starting to level off, because DOMS tends to disappear after about 2 to 3 days or starts to taper off. Then do your static passive stretching, okay? Because remember, stretching, even static passive stretching, is still mechanical loading, mechanical stress of the muscle fibers. You mentioned that the stretch should be felt in the belly of the muscle. What would be the belly of the muscle in outward rotation of a hip flexor stretch? How do you know if you don't put stress on the ligament? It's difficult to tell specifically what tissues are being stretched. Just trying to think of the outward rotation of a hip flexor stretch. I'm not able to picture that in my head. Generally, if you feel discomfort in the joint, because ligament stretching isn't a nice sensation, or any kind of strain being dumped onto a joint and joint capsule, it's not a nice sensation. It feels weird and uncomfortable, and the joint feels a bit unstable. I'm trying to picture the stretch you mean, but my brain's gone. Outward rotation of a hip flexor stretch. Yeah, I'm not sure what stretch you mean. If you name a stretch, I'll be able to pick that up. I don't know if you mean standing, seated, what, and the position you're in will dictate the leverage that you feel. But yeah, how do you know you don't put stress on the ligament? Well, ligaments are in the joint capsule, or they're in the area where the bones meet. So if you're doing a middle split stretch and you felt pain on the inside of your knees, there's very likely going to be load being dumped on the MCL, the medial collateral ligament, amongst other structures. Okay, so the position or where you feel tension tends to be a dead giveaway. Do you have literature on this arrangement for the warm-up? Yeah, I'll put references in the group. If I don't put them in by tomorrow, just send me a message, okay, and I'll do that for you. What's the difference between joint rotations and dynamic stretching? Joint rotations are dynamic active stretches, okay? They're just done in a circular fashion. That's it, okay? Is it safe to feel hamstring stretches behind the knee, say head to toe stretch? Yes and no, because we do have, a muscle behind the actual joint of the knee. But generally speaking, if we're stretching the hamstrings, I try to keep the stretch in the belly of the hamstrings group, the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris. Yeah, so I tend to avoid feeling stretching sensations in the joint itself. We can get the same or better results by just stressing the bellies of the muscles rather than the actual joint structures. Okay, so is it safe? It might be safe. It might be unsafe, but it's just you can get the same results by just stretching the muscles instead. So stick to what we know is safe. What about stretching at the end of a workout? What type of stretch is best at the end of a workout? Okay, so at the end of a strength workout, static active / isometric stretching is best because it's a strength-based input, and static passive stretches are best done for increasing flexibility at the end of a workout when you're warm and the tissues are pliable. You have to put in less effort to get a good stretch compared to if you stretch cold. I know there's a few more questions. I'm just going to move on to the next slide because I realize we are getting on a bit. And this is the last one, I promise. So this final myth is the claim that responses to static passive stretching are only neural. And what I mean by this is that people claim that adaptations to stretching only occur in the neural system. And again, we need clarity on this because it's not entirely true. There is some truth to it, but that word "only" is a real problem. And this myth arose because in the 1990s, researchers started to find that in some situations, when a test subject was strapped into a dynamometer, which is a specialized machine that measures the amount of force required to stretch a tissue under passive conditions, they found that the amount of force required to stretch the muscle didn't change after repeated bouts of stretching. Now, if there was a change in the mechanical properties of the tissues, so the passive properties of the tissues, the amount of force would decrease over time. But when that didn't happen, they came up with this idea that a person was able to stretch further despite the same or more force being required, simply because they were better able to tolerate the stretch. And this gave rise to something called the stretch tolerance theory. It's also called the sensory theory model. And the idea is that increases in flexibility following static passive stretching and even isometric stretching in some cases are primarily down to changes in how well you can handle the discomfort of the stretch. And there is a lot of evidence to support this hypothesis, because it's still just a hypothesis. Most of what we know about the nervous system is a complete guess, okay? But a lot of people don't like to admit that. And it certainly does play a large part in how our body responds to stretching. But it's not the only part, and this is where people get confused. Responses to stretching are neural in nature, yes, but they are not only neural. And this is the part I want to address. And there's several obstacles or problems that this model faces, or the claim that the stretch tolerance theory is the only thing that explains stretching adaptations. The first is a lot of those studies had methodological issues, meaning how they were put together and carried out. And many of them didn't measure total muscle length. What this means in basic terms is they may have confused a change in stretch tolerance with a change in muscle length. Okay, so I'm going to be doing some articles on this in the coming days and weeks. So that doesn't make much sense now. Don't worry too much about it. But the studies which came up with this idea of stretch tolerance, not all of them, but some of them, were not very well designed. Okay. The other issue, or the second problem, is delayed onset muscle soreness. Delayed onset muscle soreness happens because physical damage occurs in the muscle being stressed, and it occurs because of physical and chemical damage, right? And when we adapt and our bodies get stronger, that same stimulus doesn't cause soreness anymore. Okay, so you do some bicep curls, you're sore the next day or next few days. You do the same bicep curls again. Next time you're not so sore. You do them a third or fourth time, a third or fourth workout, you don't get any soreness. You've adapted, and so you would increase the weight to stimulate an adaptive response, okay? Static passive stretching alone can cause delayed onset muscle soreness. There was a really good study done in 1993 by Lucille Smith and her colleagues, which showed that static passive stretching, if done intensely enough with people who are not conditioned to it, can cause greater DOMS than ballistic stretching, okay? And what this means is that the tensile loading, the mechanical loading of the tissues, is causing physical damage or mechanical stress to the muscle fibers, and that's what's causing the DOMS. Now, so you stretch, you get DOMS, you stretch again, you don't get as much DOMS, you stretch again, you get no DOMS. This is indicative of an adaptive response. Then you stretch further and you get a little bit of DOMS again. This is showing that the tissues have been stressed to a greater length. This means that logically there must be some adaptive response happening with the longitudinal extension of the fibers. Most likely the muscle fibers are, being subjected to longitudinal hypertrophy, okay, which I'll come to in a minute when it comes to cellular research. So the stretch tolerance model cannot account for delayed onset muscle soreness. It's like this big black hole in the stretch tolerance model. It's absolutely fine if we say adaptations are both physical and neural, but anti-stretching zealots don't like to say that. They're like, for some reason people say, well, adaptations are only neural, therefore stretching is useless. That's absolutely bonkers. Even if stretching adaptations were only neural, it still works, and it still works very well. So don't listen to those idiots. Another obstacle that this model faces is that we do have evidence that under certain conditions, static stretching will increase fascicle length. Okay, so that's a certain level of the muscle or the muscle structure at a certain scale. Muscles, muscle fibers, muscle fascicles don't run from one end to the other. Some do, but some run a third of the way, some run, all the way, and the muscle kind of adapts its length at different areas to accommodate the demand that's being placed upon. And this is why we can get increases in muscle fascicle length without the physical distance between the two attachment points changing, okay? Because people tend to say, well, if there can't possibly be a change in muscle length because the attachment points don't change. The attachment points here, the tendons here, but the changes are occurring in the muscle itself, okay? And some great studies for this are referenced here, Freitas and Milhomans, and Simpson and colleagues in 2017. Now, certain conditions have to be met here, and it's pointing us more towards the idea that we have to have a certain level of intensity, usually quite high, and it has to probably be a continuous stretch for several minutes to elicit these responses. And it's likely that adaptations to static stretching are very similar to what happens with strength training. The first kind of, 6 weeks or so are neural in nature, as happens with strength training. We get greater neuromuscular efficiency. Then 6 weeks onwards, we start to see these physical changes, and that situation is replicating itself with these static stretching studies as well. Okay, but many of the studies which say stretching doesn't increase physical length of muscles don't actually measure the physical length. So it makes you ask, what's the point? The fourth obstacle is the cellular research. And we have such an abundance of evidence from the cellular research that correlates with the findings we see in the flexibility literature, because evidence doesn't always have to be direct. We can use indirect evidence as well from other areas. And we know from animal and cellular studies that tissues respond to passive stretching by getting longer, okay, something called sarcomerogenesis. There's also the issue with the cellular research. There's a field of cellular biomechanics called mechanobiology, and that tells us how cells respond to the forces that are being dumped upon them. And our cells have these mechanical sensing systems which were retained from the earliest primitive cells, although they've been adapted a bit over time as evolution has gone on. And these mechanical sensing systems monitor both the internal state of the whole organism, us, as well as our external environment. And mechanical stresses like stretching alter the structural and functional properties of cells at the cellular, the molecular, and the genetic levels, which leads to very fast responses in the adjacent tissues, as well as slower adaptive changes to a sustained mechanical environment, as occurs with stretching. And there's been great research done by a team led by Helen Langevin, who's a very famous cellular biology researcher from Canada, and she showed that it takes around 2 minutes for fibroblasts, which are cells within the connective tissue, to start creating physical change. And that correlates with the studies that I've cited here. It takes a couple of minutes before we start to see these changes occurring in the structure of the muscle fibers. Okay, so stretching is only neural is such a short-sighted myth that it doesn't account for the methodology of the studies, doesn't account for delayed onset muscle soreness, doesn't account for studies which have demonstrated physical changes in muscle length from stretching, and it completely bypasses this mountain of cellular research that tells us how cells respond to their mechanical environment. There's this massive biological cascade of protein synthesis and ion channels happening that we can't say stretching is only neural. Okay, if we did, we would have to accept that static stretching is the only thing we do which doesn't have a physical biological response that is entirely neural. Okay, so stretching is neural, and a large part of it is neural. We have to work with the nervous system if we want to improve flexibility, but it ain't the only thing. Boom, questions. Okay, so that is the lecture finish. I apologize, that went on for an hour and a half. I apologize, it was only meant to be 45 minutes. I'm just gonna get my phone and answer your questions. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's have a look. Let's have a look here. So I meant like seated butterfly seated stretch. I don't know how to explain it. In the seated butterfly stretch, Roberto, you should feel it in the short adductors primarily. That's mainly where you should feel it. You may feel it on the outside of the hip as well, depending on how close your knees are to your kind of in line with your pelvis and how close your feet are to your groin. Is it okay for people with hypermobility in knees? Okay. Is it safe to feel hamstring stretches behind the knee for people with hypermobility in the knees? I would say no, because hypermobility, which is to do with the shape and structure of the joints as well as connective tissue things. This is why it's called mobility, because it's the mobility of the internal joint structure, the joint geometry. I would say no, because that joint is already susceptible to abnormal amplitudes of motion. So I would say don't have any stretching sensation in the joints. What about stretching for recovery between intense activities? For example, let's say I have a 2-day basketball tournament with games on Saturday and Sunday. What's the best stretch style to do on Saturday night to ensure muscles are not sore for Sunday? The thing about stretching is it doesn't really help with recovery. Recovery is mostly about load management. So if stretching makes you feel good and makes you feel ready, then do it. But many people don't benefit from stretching for recovery. The primary tool of stretching is to increase flexibility. Now, the better your flexibility, the less is the metabolic cost of certain activities. But that's an individual thing depending on you and the sport. So yeah, but I mean, on the Saturday night, to make sure you're not sore for Sunday, yeah, just gentle stretching. but just good nutrition, a good night's sleep will probably do you better, to be honest. From my own experience, after high intensity but low volume strength training, static stretching is enhanced. Yeah, probably because you're very warm, and the muscles have been elongated anyway. But yeah, stretching and strength training in the same workout is a killer combination. Is there a time and attention number we should aim for per week if the goal is to gain a range of motion, like for example, 5 mins per muscle group per week? I would say my general recommendation is a couple of sets of 1 to 2 minutes, 3 to 5 times per week. Try that and see how it works for you. Yeah. Katrina says this could also be because of the nerves, though, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so, pain in joints or weird sensations in joints is not always down to loading the structures. It can be due to neural tension, but neural tension, we tend to see this cascade of sensation, not just in the knee, but down into the calf and even up into the hamstrings. So try some nerve glides, nerve flossing, see if that helps. And having pain in the ligament and inside of the knee while doing a standing middle split stretch, you said you have to change the position to target the belly of the muscle. Is this mostly referred to rotate your knee outward? No, generally with the standing side split or standing middle split, your knees are pointing forwards. It may be, if you're feeling pain on the inside of the knee, you have to bring your feet closer together because you might be stretching the muscles a bit too far than what you're ready for, basically. If you're doing static passive stretches, you can place your hands on a chair in front of you to take some of the weight off the joint. I'm going to answer 2 more questions and then I'm going to go because it's been a long night. How long is the gap between static passive stretches and dynamic active stretches? Most people generally can show about 50 to 60% of their static passive flexibility in a dynamic motion. So if you could do a 180-degree split, you could generally show about 90 to 100 degrees dynamically without training. With training, it increases, right? Can you explain the effects and reasons behind weighted flexibility training? Yeah, so weighted flexibility training is primarily called eccentric stretching. And one of the main reasons is it physically lengthens the muscle. There was a study by, oh God, what was his name? I'll post it tomorrow. The name's gone out of my head. But it was a study on eccentric training, and they said the primary reason why eccentric stretching or eccentric training works is because it physically increases muscle fiber length. Okay. All right. So guys, thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to go because I've been on about 40 minutes longer than I intended to. I'll try to make tomorrow's a bit shorter to make up for it, but I hope you enjoyed this. Any other questions? If I haven't answered your question, please repost it in the comments. If you have any watching this back, post them in the comments. Any questions that just pop up in your head, post them in the comments. So I'm going to go, guys. Thank you for your time and attention. Any questions, get in touch. Okay. All right, folks. Later.